So wonderful to feel the energy in the room on the topic of 1919. So we are continuing now with our first keynote address by Adam Tooze. Adam Tooze has had a very illustrious career and seems to only gain steam with each coming 6 months. If you read the press, anything from the Financial Times to the Guardian to Foreign Affairs or the Economist, you have certainly seen his name in recent years. Adam taught. He began at the University of Cambridge. He was Reader in Modern History and a Gurney Hart Fellow in History at Jesus College. After Cambridge, Adam was appointed to the Barton M. Biggs Professorship at Yale University, where he succeeded Paul Kennedy as the Director of International Security Studies. And he then joined the Columbia University's History Department in the summer of 2015. As I said, he has written widely, both in the press and in scholarly journals, as well as a number of very important books. They've been translated into 11 languages. His first book, Statistics in the German State, The Making of a Modern Economic Knowledge, appeared in 2001. Wages of Destruction, The Making and Breaking of the Nazi Economy, which sort of shaped much thinking on economic history of the first part of the 20th century, far outside the field just of German history, was published in 2006. He then published Deluge, The Great War and the Remaking of the Global Order, 1916-1931 in 2014. And most recently, you may have seen his book Crashed, a very compelling history of the present, if you will, of the recent financial crisis and its fallout. Adam Tooze has won a plethora of prizes, including a Leverhulme Prize Fellowship, HSO's Kulthistorische Bücher Prize, the Longman History Today Prize, the Wolfson Prize, the LA Times History Prize, and has been shortlisted for countless others. It is a great pleasure to hear him today. His talk, the title for his talk, as you can see, will be Versailles and the Interwar Crisis, the Problem of Hegemony Revisited. Thank you very much.
Hi, it's a great pleasure to be here. It really is a fabulous event that AUP, its staff, and my two colleagues have put together here. The hospitality has been quite fabulous. Looking around this room, sitting at the back, I couldn't help thinking, this must have been a little bit what it was like. The mirrors, the glamour, the discomfort, the slight impracticality, the glamour, the significance of it all. It's slightly smaller here than the Hall of Mirrors, but only ever so slightly, as we had the pleasure of seeing in a wonderful tour of Versailles that we had the privilege of being part of, many of us, yesterday. So a great big thank you. I'm sure this goes for many of the academics here as well. It's not often that one gets to attend academic conferences under such circumstances. I also would like to add a note of apology. As many of you have noted, it's graduation season. Many of you are happily here attending the graduation of your children, grandchildren perhaps. My happiness is that I'm going to have to jet back this afternoon because my daughter's graduating high school at the weekend and I simply have to be there. So apologies for that. It's really bad form to give a keynote and then leave after lunch, but there's really nothing I can do about it at this time of year, this particular year. The conference agenda, as was outlined for us this morning, I think is really quite radical and very thought-provoking. The project of globalizing the history of 1919 really is current, it's important, and I think the program of this conference does it in really quite an extraordinary way. I wasn't quite prepared for the heavyweight German history panel that we had this morning, which I thought was absolutely fabulous. But you'll see as you go on, for the next couple of days, that the tone and the geographic focus shifts radically to places that as people interested in the history of 1919 you may never have thought of before. There's going to be papers about Catalonian nationalism, about the role of Portugal, two entire panels on the history of Asia in 1919. And I would wager that 10 years ago, For the vast majority of us in this room, the significance of May 4th, 1919 was probably lost on most of us. It certainly was on me when I began writing that history of the post-war period, the book that was called Deluge. It was one of the great discoveries of me, the significance of the Chinese dimension. Nowadays, that teenager of mine was literally proposing to write an essay for one of her senior classes last year, not on China as a victim of imperialism, but on China's own neo-imperialism. This is how rapidly the agenda is shifting in the world all around us. So I think the conference sums up and captures many of the crucial shifts that are going on, not just in the academic discipline, not just following, if you like, the curiosity of historians who just fundamentally want to talk about something new and interesting beyond the age-old debates about Germany and France, Alsace-Lorraine and so on, but also an urgency, a currentness, a contemporaneous of concerns, which I think is absolutely admirable. But I must admit that looking at the programme as a little bit of an old warhorse on these kind of topics, there was a sort of slight sense of anxiety on my part, and that's what I really want to explore in this talk today. Think of it perhaps as a complement to what you're going to be hearing in so many of the other panels today. And it's that tension that Stephen Sawyer alluded to in his wonderful introduction a couple of hours ago. This sense that at Paris in 1919 there were two dynamics at play, represented, if you like, by, wrong button, this one here, these two images. On the one hand, the now famous seating plan of the horse-shaped table at which the delegates sat in Versailles in 1919, published and I think made well known to modern academics above all by Erasmus Manella's path-breaking book on the Wilsonian moment. That's certainly where I saw it for the first time. It was a shock. Britain, America and France, where you'd expect at the top of the table, but then look at all the other countries that are there, from Siam to Saudi Arabia to Portugal to Brazil. This was indeed a global gathering. India represented in its own right as an integral part of the British war effort. That's the one story of Versailles, the story that we desperately need to explore and that this conference is doing so much work to expose for us. But the other story of Versailles is the image on the right-hand side, the shocking, to some extent scandalous degree to which this conference, which was billed as the beginning of a new era in diplomacy, of open covenants openly arrived at, in fact ended up revolving around the machinations between three elderly white gentlemen on the left-hand side here, the so-called Big Three, Woodrow Wilson, Lloyd George, and Georges Clemenceau. And Georges Clemenceau's age is itself remarkable. This is a man born, I think, in 1843. Who vividly remembered the danger that his father was exposed to in the wake of the 1848 revolution, who grew up in a culture steeped in Normandy in the memories of the Jacobin revolution and the bloody Vendée counter-revolutionary campaigns of the 1790s. A man whose biography spans the 18th century with the 20th century. So this is the other story that we have to get to grips with, and that's really going to be the driving impetus behind my talk today. The question of what articulates these two dimensions, the dispersive and the implosive quality of Paris that never before had so much power being concentrated in the hands of so many people. And it's that word power that for me is absolutely central. Not significance or interest or modern contemporary interest, but the question of who actually controlled the situation in 1919. Because that's a story of the battle between these two forces. No one felt the massive concentration of power that occurred in 1919 more vividly, of course, than the Germans. The standard image, again, those big three leading the poor German Michael, the Deutsche Michel, to execution by the guillotine. Clemenceau, famously an advocate of the revolutionary terror. You take it or you leave it, was his view on the French Revolution. You don't get to split, you take the revolution en bloc, which he enthusiastically did. This, a story about the coercive power of Versailles, which we cannot and must not, I think, forget. But what was driving that? And here again, we're back in the story of the new, because one of the truly dramatic aspects of the Versailles Peace Treaty was, of course, the reparations settlement. And one of the fundamental questions we have to ask ourselves is why the reparations settlement was as large as it was. And when you do that, you begin to realize that one of the enormous pressures that these powerful three statesmen were under was, in fact, the fact that they were rulers, democratic rulers, as Stephen was insisting, of welfare states. One of the tragedies of the Versailles Peace Treaty is it's the first large-scale peace treaty made between welfare states. There is a direct link between the promise to the British population of the homes fit for heroes and the relentless emphasis of the Lloyd George administration on the demand for massive reparations from Germany. Lloyd George is not just Britain's great war leader and an ambitious politician, as we had explained earlier today. He's also the father of the British welfare state and the manager of one of the great political bargains of the early 20th century between Liberals and Labour. If you think further, beyond the treaty itself, this sense of power concentrating as a result of a total war on the states which were strongest and most capable of bearing the load, the sense that at Versailles really there were only 3 states left from the pre-war order that could still carry the weight of power, that sense becomes even more concentrated. One of my weaknesses is that I'm an economic historian and I love charts and numbers, and I'm going to unfortunately torture you a little bit with that in the next few minutes. What we see in the aftermath of 1919, and what is graphically displayed in this price data here, is that the world after Versailles segments not just into the big 3 and the rest. It segments, in fact, into 3 separate segments. At the top of the hierarchy of chaos and disorder are, of course, the Germans, whose price level you can see exploding astronomically away at the top of this graph, which is using a logarithmic scale to compress the numbers. In the middle group, you find France and Italy, currencies that don't experience hyperinflation, but stabilize at dramatically devalued and deflated levels. The only great powers to really come through the crisis with their financial integrity intact would be Great Britain, the United States, and to a lesser extent, one could argue about how far it really qualifies, Japan. The world is concentrating financial authority in the hands of a remarkably small group of powers in the wake of the huge test of total war. And if you want the final demonstration, if you like, of the absolutely stark clarity of the hierarchical nation of power in the aftermath of World War I, the antithesis to the centrifugal tendency, which is also so manifest in this period, it's the conference held to discuss naval terms in November 1921. 3 highly significant things about this conference. The first is its location. It is the first major global international conference held in Washington, D.C., under the auspices of a Republican administration. Secondly, the business of the conference was to fix the scale of battleship fleets. Why this matters is that the battleship didn't actually prove itself as a very valuable weapon in World War I, but it's the ultimate guarantor of naval power. And naval power matters because it's the ultimate guarantor in the thinking of international relations theorists in the interwar period of the blockade, of the ability to shut your enemy's economy off from supplies from the outside. Having a battleship fleet in the background defines your ability to do that. And the Washington Conference of November 1921 literally enumerates global power in numerical terms. 5, 5, 3, 1.75, 1.75. 5 for the US and the United States and Great Britain. 3 for Japan, 1.75 for France and for Italy. This means that naval power is held more tightly after World War I than nuclear weapons are today. It's that kind of a cabal. Russia and Germany, major contenders in the more pluralistic world of the pre-war world order, are not even at the conference. They're not granted the right to imagine themselves as great powers. This was the theme that Eric Grimmer-Solem was bringing out so brilliantly in his presentation this morning. The game is over for them. This is the new order of world power as it is defined by World War I. Now, you can think of the Washington Conference as an anachronistic conference. It's the last great effort, arguably, to impose a meta-imperialist regime on China in the 1920s. It's the last great effort to formalize in the Nine-Power Treaty the relationship between these countries having spheres of interest in China and the American principle of the open door. Its vision of how to stabilize China, which is key to the naval architecture because Japan is a key element in the naval deal of 1921. So China is the key issue of concern to Japan. its vision of how to stabilize China is an anachronistic great power cartel that will manage the forces of Chinese nationalism by controlling the flow of money into China. It's a bust. It never had any prospect of being accepted in China. Any Chinese government that signed up to it effectively discredited itself in the process of doing so. It's a demonstration of vanity, really, of Western power. To that extent, it fits very nicely with the broader themes of the conference. On the other hand, in terms of the construction of naval power, Washington, in fact, defines not just the interwar period, arguably, but the entire 20th century. The battleship building ban works. It structures the development of the Japanese fleet in such a way as to make the Pacific War incredibly one-sided. And it has a similar effect on the insurgent navies of Germany and Italy when they start to outbuild or attempt to outbuild in the 1930s. That order, that numerical order of power, encoded in 1921, essentially does define global power as defined by maritime power in the early 20th century. It is by no means merely a scrap of paper. One of the themes, therefore, I think that we need to take up is precisely the point that Ryan made so powerfully in an answer that he gave to one of the no, it wasn't Ryan, was it? Sorry. This is a recurring problem, Sean. The answer that you gave brilliantly to this question of the 1880s and the development of Western imperialism from the 1880s onwards. That, I think, is precisely right. If we want to understand the dynamic of anti-imperialist politics in the interwar period, what we have to reckon with is the new coherence, the extraordinary self-conscious way in which global power is in fact being organized by the last imperial powers standing after the great test of the war. And that, of course, produces a great efflorescence of anti-imperial thought from the 1920s onwards. This is the heyday of transnational anti-imperialism, and it's become a center of greatly revealing, fascinating new historical research. But we should also be attentive to the tone in which the anti-imperialists speak. We are, I think, tempted by the hindsight of knowing, as Stephen indicated in his opening remarks, that we know in the end, after all, that the days of the imperial order were numbered and the clock was running out. That is not how it appeared to all of those who were clear-eyed in their perception of how power had concentrated after World War I. By no means. Again, if you look at the Germans, who are at the epicenter of this new power structure, you see philosophers and historians asking themselves the question, which is really hauntingly reminiscent of 1989 and the post-historic moment of Francis Fukuyama. If the origin of history, literally the academic history, discipline of history, is in the birth of European nationalism, and the end of World War I is really the crushing of the hopes, as Eric described it so nicely, of one of the great 19th century European power political projects, does that perhaps mean that history, in the sense the 19th century understood it, is ending for Europe? This is Friedrich Meinecke. By no means, he's one of these transitional people, part nationalist, part liberal, describing the aftermath of Versailles. The character of the modern European state existence threatens to come to grief. This would indeed mean that the historical role of Europe is played out. Europe would be reduced to the level of burnt-out volcanoes or fellaheen states, to use the pejorative Orientalist language of Oswald Spengler. But it isn't just people like Meinecke, intellectuals like him, whose vision is animated this way. This is Adolf Hitler, on the subversive way in which the American example of affluence, of the standard of living, is eating away at the fabric of European polities. Europeans today dream of a standard of living which they derive from Europe's possibilities, less from the Europe's possibilities really, as from the real conditions of America. Due to modern technology and the communication it makes possible, this is Hitler writing in the 1920s, not a globalization theorist in the 1980s and 1990s. Due to Hollywood, in other words, Europeans have developed an intimate sense of what a good lifestyle is, and it belongs to somebody else. Europe is being provincialized by the rise of American affluence, and for Hitler this has concrete political implications. Unless the political leaders of Europe could shake their populations out of their usual political thoughtlessness, the threatened global hegemony of the North American continent would reduce them all to the status of Switzerland or Holland. Cheese and cuckoo clocks will be the destiny of Europe in this post-historic age. It doesn't seem to me, in light of Ambassador Burns's remarks earlier today, that we could escape the actuality of these kind of thoughts even today. And it's against this threat that Hitler defines the project of National Socialism, rallying Europe under German leadership to the project of fronting up against American domination. And these thoughts don't just come from the right. Leon Trotsky, in the mid-1920s, thinking about what he thinks of as the failure of the Russian Revolution to make a fundamental break. Remember, he's at odds with Stalin, is having to come to terms with the fact that his glorious revolution is turning into a bureaucratic monster. What is happening in the wider world that is encasing the Soviet experiment? And Trotsky, very much in the same vein as Hitler, that Europe finds itself in the 1920s as balkanized, reduced to the same sort of state that southeastern Europe once occupied in relation to Paris and London. Paris has become Serbia, whereas Serbia once, of course, was the subordinate and client of France. I wonder whether that's a fatal thing. Do we need to worry about Desmarais? Or Ray Desmarais? That sounds even worse. Plutarch. Yeah, I'm definitely in favour of that. The entire political life, the insides of European politics, according to Trotsky, were being shaped by this pressure of American power, of American wealth. And here, from a very different angle, from a different politics altogether, Churchill effectively confirming the same basic diagnosis, except from his point of view, not as a nightmare vision of history ending for radical politics, but as a sanguine expectation that everything was going to be all right. Not on the basis of the Versailles Peace Treaty, but on what was built on it. Two great pyramids, which lacked any precedent of history, one of which was the Washington Naval Conference, and the other was the Locarno Agreement, for which, as was remarked earlier on, Gustav Stresemann won the Nobel Prize, along with his British and French counterparts. So all of these different perspectives united in a sense that something fundamental had shifted, power had in fact been consolidated, and radical alternatives were being systematically closed down as a definition of the period. Now, we can, of course, chuckle and say to ourselves, well, classically, people failing to understand how history is going to develop, a fundamental misunderstanding, liberal complacency that will be soon taught the tough logic of realism. They will have to wake up and smell the coffee sooner or later. And Churchill, after all, was famous for changing his mind. So that's one way of reading those statements. I would resist that and push back against it. Not only is that a form of condescending hindsight, which historians have a job to resist, but furthermore, it ignores the evidence from the side of the insurgents. When fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, the Soviet Union make their effort to break this unipolar dominance of the Western powers, the effort that they make is testimony to how seriously they took the obstacle they were up against. It was put again very well by several speakers earlier this morning. The accusation against the world created by the Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations is not that it's weak. The accusation is it's hypocritical because it hides massive power within the velvet glove of liberalism and international relations. And if you want statistical evidence of this, and again, it's my weakness, but let me show you the numbers because they truly are dramatic. If you want evidence of this, just look at the scale of the effort made in the 1930s in preparation for the next war. If World War I was total, World War II was going to be massively more so. And you can see that not just in the conduct of the war, but in the preparations, perhaps even more tellingly for it. So what I've done here is compared the famous arms race before 1914 to the arms race of the 1930s, using comparable economic statistics that we now have from global economic databases. And the numbers that you can see, the really significant ones are on the bottom right-hand side there. If we take 1913, so Imperial Germany, Edwardian Britain, Tsarist Russia as the benchmark, by the 1930s, the major rivals for power are outspending their pre-1914 spending levels by a factor of somewhere between 4 and 8. 4 and 8. This is a completely unprecedented military economic effort. This is the backhanded compliment that the insurgents pay to the power of the liberal order established at Versailles. We don't like it, we think you're hypocrites, but we sure as hell understand that to overcome the power that you've established, we're going to have to try harder than ever before. Stalin put it very well in one of the addresses with which he initiated the first five-year plan. Comrades, we must do this, otherwise they will bury us. The defeat of Imperial Germany in 1918 sends a message around the world that contending with the Western established empires is a dangerous thing to do. You need to mobilize as never before. And they did, and the consequences were disastrous, catastrophic, ultimately. For all the criticisms of Versailles that one can make, there isn't that it enabled the defeated to right the wrongs of their defeat. The order that was established was in fact rock hard in the end and massively devastating in the retaliation, in the reaction that it produced. The consequences for Germany after 1945 infinitely more severe than the consequences of Germany for Germany after 1919. The question we have to ask, of course, is what made this possible? How were these insurgent states able to break out? And that's what I want to spend the last 15 minutes or so of my talk talking about. Why was this monolithic power, in the end, in fact, susceptible to subversion? What gave it both its monolithic quality and its fragility? And I think that's a question, as Ambassador Burns was suggesting earlier on, has an actuality and ought to haunt us even in the present day. Now, one element of this, which will be addressed by several of the panels later on, is the weakness of international legalism in the interwar period. It isn't that there was any lack of ideas. There was indeed a fecund period of thinking about liberal internationalism, but it fundamentally fails to deliver an effective coercive mechanism that's able, as this cartoon rather nicely illustrates, there's the Japanese shell going through the pieces of paper, and the first one it goes through is the Nine-Power Treaty signed in Washington in early 1922. That's one part of the story. Another part of the story are the regional dynamics, which so many of the panels of this conference concentrate on to such good effect. And there are two major regions out of which macroscopic pressures for war were generated by the 1930s. And the first of them is Eastern Europe, the cauldron out of which the European escalation grows. And I think the crucial and very simple point to make is that this should not be surprising. It should not be surprising because it's not true to say that Germany lost World War I in a simple sense. Germany, in fact, won the war in the East, conclusively. Germany refuted the simplistic logic and the common sense that it's a bad idea to invade Russia. If you do it the right way, Germany proved that you can, in fact, destroy Tsarist power and dismember it, and do so in a process that will in fact also erode the structures of the Russian state, the Germans being active sponsors of the Bolsheviks in the early phase. And the map that the Germans drew at the peace that they signed in the East in the spring of 1918 is shocking in two ways. It's shocking because it looks an awful lot like the map that was drawn for the similar areas after 1919 by Versailles. Why? Because both the German liberal imperialists and Western Europe's liberal imperialists, as Eric Ribosolem was highlighting, are working on the same basic premises. In other words, there has to be some kind of Polish state. There is going to be a fragmentation of the imperial structure of Eastern Europe. The question is precisely how it's going to be worked out. But what's clear from the point of view of liberal imperialists in Berlin is that this may not be a very bad thing for Germany at all. On the contrary, this may be a structure which is extremely amenable to the extension of German power, as it has also proved to be since 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union. So this is a power structure which is unstable and gives German leverage, and if Germany is not a satisfied but is a revisionist power, it creates the possibility for destabilizing alliances, one of which, of course, is the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939. And at the other end of the world, we have the racially entangled, profound geopolitical dilemmas of East Asia, which are summed up in this horrible, grotesque cartoon, this caricature of Japanese imperialism as a threat to all Uha around it. Another way of thinking of the East Asian scenario is that there is one of the most basic geopolitical impasse which we, even in the present day, fail really to have any good answers for. Japan perched on the outer edge of the three great imponderables of 20th century history. China, Russia, and the United States are its strategic counterparts. It's a vastly unstable situation which the Japanese elite struggle to maneuver their way through in a recipe for armed conflict, which the post-war peace did not provide any solid answers for. So you can provide, if you like, a region-by-region analysis of how the post-war world was destabilized. What about common denominators? And I want to push towards the conclusion of this talk by reference to two of those. And the most significant one, which I think really needs to be emphasized in its significance, is the weakness of the British Empire. Why does the British Empire matter so much? Because it's within the matrix created by the British from the 1850s onwards, both in strategic terms and in technological terms with a network of telegraphs, of coaling stations, that globalization happened from the mid-19th century onwards. It was the first truly global empire of modern history, and in fact all the way down to the present day remains the most dramatic in its extension. And its state of overload is very nicely captured by this cartoon here of the dog arriving in Lloyd George's office, hoping to rescue him from the impasse of foreign and domestic crises which the British Prime Minister is struggling to control. And it was indeed a massive overload. India doesn't feature directly on the programme, but from the point of view of the British Empire, it is the be-all and end-all of the British political structure. And to understand the way in which British imperialism works, you have to take seriously its belief, credible or not, that it operated through mechanisms of consent as well as through mechanisms of coercion. And the disaster which the British elite see unfolding before them in India in the aftermath of World War I is that bluff is being called. It's always susceptible to being called. It used to be called at a rhythm spanning over decades. What's happening in the aftermath of World War I is that the liberal bluff, the bluff of liberal empire, is being called in a matter of months. So Britain makes the most spectacular offer of the enfranchisement of an Indian elite it ever made in 1917 or whatever made up to that point. It carries it through in the aftermath, and it is essentially rejected by the nationalist political class, symbolised by Gandhi here, facing with the British with the need to, in fact, coercively rule India, which is a nightmarish prospect, as they're witnessing in Ireland. And within the British Empire, it's not self-determination, but the slogan of home rule that rattles back and forth between Ireland and India at this moment. The Irish problem is a conundrum which haunts Britain and Europe all the way down, of course, to the latest Brexit negotiations. It's anything but an incidental accident. It's core to the problems of the stabilisation of the British Empire in the 20th century. And at the same time, Lloyd George has to manage a huge upsurge of domestic discontent. A massive, unprecedented mobilisation of the British working class, the true breakthrough of class politics. And all of this is framed by the fact that the UK, as was remarked earlier on, is desperately short of money and knows it, is hovering on the edge of bankruptcy. And bankruptcy for Britain has a peculiar character because British power since the 17th century has been founded precisely on financial authority. It's not a state that weighs military power against money. It's a state which turns money into military power more effectively than any of its competitors. And this is the financial disaster facing Britain is very imminent, is very real, and it forces a compulsive effort on the part of the British elite at huge cost in terms of domestic politics to deliver parity between sterling, the British currency, and the dollar as currencies of investment in the aftermath of World War I. Often denounced as a matter of vanity and status seeking, it's about as vain and status seeking as agreeing to pay back your credit card. It's a matter not of vanity and status seeking, it's a matter of credit rating, which is fundamental to your ability to function in a modern financial economy. But without this pressure, you cannot understand the agreement of the British in the fall of 1921 to that remarkable naval deal. And the significance of that for the present moment is that that marks a moment in which two rivals for global power step away from the Thucydides trap. This is the key answer to the problem haunting policymakers in Washington and Beijing at the current moment. Is it possible to organize a transition of power which doesn't involve conflict. And the British state, under the pressure of its domestic and imperial problems in November 1921, agrees to do that by agreeing to give up the absolute dominance claimed by the Royal Navy, and instead agreeing to parity. All of this, however, leaves the British hanging. The British are deeply aware that the Versailles Treaty wasn't enough. They're acutely aware of the Eastern European danger. They're acutely aware of the turmoil in East Asia. They know how limited their resources are. They desperately need a fix. And Lloyd George is nothing if not one of the most imaginative, dynamic, democratic politicians of the 20th century. Not just a war leader, not just the author of the welfare state, but also the architect of one of the most ambitious geo-economic proposals made in the wake of World War I. And this is the design of the Genoa Conference in the spring of 1922. So the idea is to get the Soviets to agree to stop doing global revolutionary propaganda. If they'll do that, the British will float a loan to support the Soviet Union. With that, the Soviets can then reconstruct their export-orientated agriculture with a railway system funded by the British. Who will the Soviets buy the railways from? They'll buy them from the Germans. If the Germans can export railways to the Soviet Union, the German economy will revive, the British will be able to export to Germany, and the Germans will be able to pay their Versailles bills. And if the Germans pay their Versailles bills, then the British and French can pay the Americans. The beauty of this is it solves all your political problems at once. It neutralizes communism, it neutralizes the Franco-German antagonism, it settles European-American relationships, it diffuses internal tensions within the United Kingdom, and I wager the vast majority of you in this room have not heard of it. My guess. And those of you who have heard of the Genoa Conference may not be fully aware of the Lloyd George grand design that lay behind it. And the reason is it was a total disaster. It was the prelude to the Rapallo deal. Right from the very beginning, the French had said, you can't be serious. You're going to do a deal with the Russians? They haven't paid us back for the money that we lent the Tsar. The Germans were going, hang on, if you put us in a room with the Russians and the French, that's like revising and reviving the World War I alliance against us. I know what you're going to do. You're going to raise the reparation bill and really drive it down our throats. The Russians look and go, and we know what this is. This is global imperialism articulating itself in the new way that we were told it's doing in the 1920s. We know they're going to put a huge reparation bill on us and force us to pay the French. The British are going, no, you don't understand. This is what we're trying to do. This is what we're trying to do. The Russians and the Germans are the most anxious. They don't buy it. And at the so-called pajama party meeting of the 16th of April 1922 in a luxurious hotel in the Rapallo neighborhood of Genoa, they get together and do the secret deal which unhinges Lloyd George's design by binding Russia and the Germans together. Even before the Hitler-Stalin pact, the thing unravels. The significance of that, now cutting a very long story short as I possibly can to get to the ending and move on to my concluding lines about America, the significance of this is that the French are left dangling by the failure of the British effort to tie the Germans and the Russian in, and the French response is to say, you know what, we're bankrupt. You know what, our currency is devalued. You know what, the Americans will only grant us 1.75 to 5 of their navy. But what we do have is the largest army still standing in Europe. It's the proud French army. It was undefeated by the Germans in the field. And we're going to use that last resort of state power and aim it at the heart of Germany, which is the Ruhr heavy industrial zone. And the first excuse the Germans give us by failing to pay reparations we're going to take to invade and restart the war and occupy the Ruhr. And it's that which precipitates the escalation of nationalism in Germany and the hyperinflation which triggers the disaster in Germany. Now, is there anything that could have stabilized this situation? I think the counterfactual question is warranted, and unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, the question points back at the United States. The president of Versailles was kind enough to remark yesterday that Versailles stands for a special relationship between Europe and America. I'm afraid it does, and in the aftermath of 1919, it stood for betrayal. That was the special relationship. It stood for the fact that the American president had arrived in Paris in 1919 promising. He had promised the Germans in the armistice negotiations what the Germans thought would be a good peace on 14 points terms. He had come as the at least associate of the British and the French, and he had then signed the treaty along with the British and the French on hard conditions hammered out in tough negotiations. He takes it back to the United States, and the United States Congress, exercising its legitimate constitutional powers under the division of powers of the American Constitution, fails to ratify the president's most spectacular action in global politics in fact, the history of the United States today. It is not, I think, John Milton Cooper's title, which is taken from Woodrow Wilson, that America broke the heart of the world at that moment is no exaggeration. So, a final 5 to 10 minutes or so on America and the question of American responsibility, because it was placed on the agenda by Ambassador Burns, and it does seem to be the current issue. We started a little late, so we'll run a little close to the time program, but it seems important to drive this point home. The first thing, I think, to understand about America's situation in the world in the aftermath of World War I is just how astonishingly novel it was. It literally wasn't until 1893 that the British decided to upgrade their legation in Washington, D.C. to embassy status. Up to that point, a posting to Washington was grossly inferior to a posting, for instance, to the Sublime Porte in Istanbul and Constantinople. Those were the classic hubs of great power diplomacy. Washington simply didn't count. You could search the literature on the causes of the outbreak of 1914, and with very few exceptions, in the classic European text, America doesn't even figure in the calculation of Europe's statesmen in 1914. How spectacularly things had changed only 2 years later, when the 1916 American presidential election becomes the first modern American political election in the sense the whole world is watching it. Everyone cares who wins that election. Why? Because Wilson's position on the war was so ambiguous. It's not clear. In fact, it's very clear that he didn't want to join the war on the side of the Entente. America was profoundly riven over this, and it seemed as though Wilson was going to use all the tools at his disposal that he was rapidly making. This is the era of progressivism. The American state is a vestigial thing that has to be brought into existence. He was going to use its powers to pull America and to keep America out of the war. Why this matters is fundamentally economic. This, again, is one of those charts that's so important for my thinking about history, and I think fundamentally illuminating. This is the size of America's, the size of the continent, the GDP of the continental United States compared to that of the British Empire. And the moment at which America overtakes the British Empire in its entirety is 1916, precisely the moment at which American power moves to the center of everyone's calculus. It's on this basis that Wilson arrives in Europe over the winter of 1918-1919 as a superstar. And it's that failure, it's the failure of America to ratify Versailles and the League of Nations covenant that is an integral part of it, that rips the foundations out from the fragile construction that the European peace was. Impossible as it was to make that peace, it became doubly so once the power that in fact ratified this post-war order was absent. And it isn't just that America reneges on the signature of its president, or Congress does, with the Republicans engaged in a bitter fight. But America also closes the door on European immigration. It raises tariffs in the form they become a tariff. The American Central Bank, 10 years into its existence, hikes interest rates and sucks gold out of the European banking system. And America refuses concessions on war debts in a way which make it impossible to revise the reparations system in Europe without huge cost to Britain and France. Why is America at this point so disabled? Part of the story is dysfunctional partisan politics. The origins of modern American partisanship go back to that moment, no doubt. But we should also recognize in America the same dynamics of social destabilization we see so prominently in Europe. These are strike figures for Europe and the United States. And if you can see the bottom line, you can see that the surge of strikes in the United States, driven by inflation there, from 1916-17 onwards, bears comparison with even the most disturbed European societies. The 1919-1920 Red Scare in the United States is not some American peculiarity. It belongs as part of a global destabilization. But most importantly of all, a point that was made earlier on that cannot be emphasized strongly enough. The master maneuver, the state machine that Wilson was deploying and his successors were deploying is tiny. So this is federal spending as a share of American GDP, and during the war and its aftermath, it peaked at 10% of American GDP. It started at 2%, it then slumps back to 4%. This has two effects. A, the American federal government doesn't really have the capacity to do global stabilization policy, and anything it does do shows up immediately in taxes that Americans pay. So 1/3 of all American debt owed by the federal government after World War I was on inter-allied account. So if they make concessions to the British and French on inter-allied debt, it strikes immediately at the tax bills of Americans to the extent of 1/3 of the tax bill that they're paying. So this is the story I'm telling you of the effort to stabilize in the aftermath of Versailles, the Washington Conference on naval power, the Genoa Conference of the British that fails, the Weimar hyperinflationary disaster that spirals out of that, the American state logjammed and unable to react. The question is there any kind of fix? And the answer to that question, the key to overcoming the impasse of American policymaking, revealed by 1919 and the aftermath, is to make an American version of Lloyd George's grand plan, to stabilize European politics on the basis of money. So to depoliticize. Don't have governments lending money to each other, but have Wall Street lend money, not to Russia now, but to Germany. Have Germany then use that money to pay back Britain and France. Have Britain and France use that to repay the American taxpayer. And by magic, you've turned debt public to public, political debts, into private debts owed by Germans to Wall Street. You have neutralized, and on a smaller scale than the British had promised, the interwar instability. Now, this sounds thin, and it's again one of these sort of oscillating images. But on the other hand, the power of the dollar is mighty, then all the way down to the present. The power of the dollar radiates across global politics in this period and produces coercion and discipline, spending discipline, fiscal discipline on the one hand, and also enabling those who cooperate with America, notably, of course, the Weimar Republic, which becomes the prime recipient of funding from the United States. But it is, and I'll end on this thought, a profoundly thin basis on which to found a fix for the troubled problems of Europe in the aftermath of World War I. It is not without its power. It is not without its efficacy. You can see why somebody like Trotsky would see in this the hidden hand of American finance at work, because it truly was at work. The question, of course, is it robust? And the answer, of course, delivered by the development of the global economy from the late 1920s onwards is tragically that it is not. What happens, and this goes back to a point made earlier, what happens to the choices of the contending factions of progressives and aggressive reactionaries as the global political economy shifts? And the lesson, of course, of the Great Depression is tragic. It's tragic in a double sense. It's tragic, first of all, because all the way through the Depression, deep into 1930-31, liberals, committed to internationalism, committed to adherence to the dollar standard, held fast, much as many Europeans did during the Eurozone crisis. Belief in the European cause ties people into fiscal discipline. At the same time, of course, it enables nationalists to say, give us the helm of state, give us power, and what we will do is demonstrate national freedom, national sovereignty by breaking out of this impasse. And the crucial thing to look at is not what radicals like Hitler do, but the way in which reasonable people shift their balance in the course of the 1930s, and how this happens not just in one state, but in Germany, Italy, Japan, simultaneously. The globalist liberal elite loses power to the nationalists who appear to be offering an alternative. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the haunting, I think, conclusion that we must draw from the interwar period, also for our fragile situation today. If you were a globally minded citizen of the world under current conditions, what choices do you think you have in the present conjuncture? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Adam. That was extremely stimulating and talk. And just to see, we have time for a quick question. I would just like to highlight the way the sort of deep revisionism that's taking place around our understandings of this event and how it forces us to profoundly rethink the relationship, in this case, clearly between the US and the world, both as a state, as a world power, and of course, its economic system and its relationships to the creating of the New World Order. So thank you again. So we have time really for probably one question, maybe two.
Why don't we take two back to back?
Okay, we'll take two back to back then. Yes.
I'm Marianne Bott. I graduated from Teachers College, Columbia University. Glad to see a New York Brit. In light of your expertise in both countries, while we were sitting here, Theresa May resigned. And I think that'll be the talk around the lunch tables, so could you perhaps say whether you would have predicted this?
Okay, we have, yes.
So I'm Jeff Wasserstrom, UC Irvine, and I'm speaking right after you leave, or I wouldn't ask the question. But I loved your big picture and talking about provincializing or bringing in other parts of the world. If you bring in China, thinking of your daughter's question, a lot of what you said, what haunts China is what happened in 1900, when they saw that the world order wasn't weak, it was strong, and it was hypocritical. There had been an invasion by a group that called themselves the Allies. There were tremendous reparations charged that really broke the state. Initially, that led to toward democratization. Now, when it's leading toward empire, 1900s invoked as a year that taught China that the way to survive in the world was you needed to be one of the powers, not one of the powerless. So a lot of what 1919 is doing, actually, when you bring more of the world in, is precursor from 1900s.
I'll do that. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, these conventions, we focus our attention on a particular moment. I do, in retrospect, coming to it from the outside, really, as somebody who isn't an Asian historian, but I do find the Boxer Rebellion and its suppression by this multinational coalition the most astonishing phenomenon of 1900. I mean, it's this. And you see both the extraordinary, as it were, unity of the imperial actors, and the enthusiasm with which everyone wants to send a contingent. The Italians, the Austrians, everyone's sending a contingent. The Japanese, of course, are a big player. You also see it as a matrix against which national differentiation happens. This is, after all, famously the moment in which the Kaiser earns himself the sobriquet, the Hun, because he literally tells, when I read this out to my very multi-ethnic audiences in Colombia, there's just visible, there's an audible intake of breath if you read out the words of the German emperor to the departing German troops, which I'll just paraphrase, are broadly speaking, deliver so much violence when you get there that no Chinese person will ever look askance at a Westerner again. Act as the Hun did, the Chinese fear the Hun. Words to this effect. I mean, it's extraordinary. So you see both the commonality and the differentiation happening. But I think you're absolutely spot on that China becomes the place, and not coincidentally, because everyone understands it's the big game of the 20th century even then, right? There's something very weird and parochializing that happens when thinkers of the order of the early 20th century end up having to worry about Silesia. Japanese diplomats are sent to sort out Silesia. I mean, this is not how Cecil Rhodes or Teddy Roosevelt imagined the 20th century going down, right? They thought this was going to be the big stage. You've got the US cavalry in full regalia riding along the Great Wall of China. I mean, why do you imagine that you think you're going to have to spend a lot of time sorting out Silesia? So China is the evident focus. If you read Hobson and these kind of people, it's clear that it all revolves around that basic question. And so it's not by accident there, I think, that the question of meta-imperialism, general imperialism, universal imperialism really gets defined and then worked out. I think there's a real issue that we need to sort out in our heads about the significance we attribute to the mandate system as the matrix for thinking about this. I wouldn't want to claim a monopoly for either one, but I sometimes feel that the mandate system is overweighted in its significance, because in the end it's dealing with the detritus of other people's empires rather than the new game of what you're going to do with the largest society on earth, which is China, China, China. May, of course, everyone knew she was going. I'm surprised that it happened right now. I didn't anticipate that. But let me bend this back to Versailles, and let me bend this back to 1919, 1920, and I said it en passant, but let me really drive this home. The party of which she is the leader and the coalition in which she has been governing are the people who took the United Kingdom to the brink of civil war in 1913, 1914. They are the direct descendants, 100 years later, the lineal descendants of that group who were willing to incite mutiny on the part of the British Army, which is, of course, largely a Northern Irish army stocked by Protestants in the barracks of Northern Ireland, against the declared will of the Parliament, which had basically committed itself to home rule, in whatever moderated form, but to home rule, and they were willing to split the integrity of the British state at a moment of maximum of international crisis over this issue once before already. This is not new. This is the same old problem that the Tory party has made into a crisis of existence for itself and for the United Kingdom before. And there is no easy fix for it. And the fixes that we've arrived at have been historically extremely violent. Ireland's tiny, so it's difficult to appreciate what it means for 4,000 or 5,000 people to have been killed in the violence in Ireland between 1918 and 1922. But it's, about half, it's like a 9/11 event for Ireland. It's roughly the same population as Manhattan and roughly the same number of casualties, if you'll forgive the loose analogy. It's a completely traumatized society in the wake of the shocking derailment of British policy, which is integrally related to the refusal of the Tory party and the Unionists and the ultras in Protestant Northern Ireland to sign up to the will of and to accept the will of the British Parliament as dispositive. So the fact that this has returned to haunt them in their moment of trying to assert sovereignty against the entity which enabled the United Kingdom to actually finally resolve the Irish problem and to give it at least halfway and passably decent. And this is, after all, the violence of the 70s, 80s and 90s was terrible too, but we ended up moving out of that, and they want to go back into that muck and tear apart the framework. I have no sympathy, I have nothing but rage and contempt for people who conduct policy in this way, and they are, by the standards of the Tory party, even the Tory party, by the standards of the Tory party, a shame on the party which they claim to represent. So good riddance. The problem, of course, is that who comes next? The man that comes next is a total joker, most likely. An irresponsible buffoon. I have an English accent and I have an English passport, but mercifully I spent most of the formative years of my life in the Federal Republic. So I speak as an outsider with very little sympathy and a lot of contempt. It's a disgrace.
Well,
no, but I speak also, I know, and I feel inhibited to a certain degree because I don't have to suffer through this, having the privilege of living in New York and being one way away from acquiring American citizenship, which I'll eagerly do, even under present circumstances.
Well, thank you, Adam.